Greetings all! In the last Q&A I'd mentioned that Felicity Lungus's question deserved a longer independent answer. Its question was as follows. In Steve Zaloga's 2004 publication on the M18 Hellcat, he makes a rather critical summary of the often praised tank destroyer. He makes the claim that, due to General Bruce's insistence on high speed, the M18 suffered from a poor balance between mobility, firepower and protection. The 76mm was inadequate for fighting tanks such as Panther upon Hellcat's introduction in 1944. It carried less ammunition and armour than the 76mm armed Shermans, and the 76mm was less effective in the infantry support role which TDs often found themselves playing. Road speeds were high, but battlefield mobility suffered thanks to the high vulnerability of crews to attacks, and as such, crews tended to act more cautiously and advance at a similar pace to other armour. Overall, it is claimed that the significant success of the M18 was to be attributed to the exceptional skills of the US TD crews, rather than any outstanding qualities of the M18. Was Zaloga's analysis correct, and the M18 somewhat overblown? Or was Hellcat truly an exceptional tank destroyer? Well, I need to be a little bit careful since Steve watches these videos. I think it's the difference between application and doctrine. Nothing he says is wrong, but at the same time, Hellcat really was an exceptional tank destroyer. Remember, TDs and anti-tank units were not the same thing in the US Army. I've gone over it before. The purpose of the TD was mobility. Anti-tank guns would be found in the front lines, usually with the infantry regiments. TDs were the fire brigade against massed armour. The M18 was the appliance. Now, I have no idea if there is a balance between pump and water capacity and fire truck design versus road speed, but I can certainly see why one may choose to sacrifice a hose or two, or maybe a few hundred gallons of water, in order to get to a fire from the fire station faster. I have mentioned how, when the M18 appeared on the scene, it was met with such hostility that the Army considered cancelling the order. To quote a Colonel Dean of Army Service Forces, "If the troops won't use them, it is useless to produce them." It had less armour than an M10 and looked too much like a Panther for comfort. One unit flat refused to exchange its M10s for M18s, eventually being convinced to trade their trusty $60,000 Foxholes for M36s. Did M10 really have enough armour over an M18 to make a practical difference on the battlefield? Probably not, honestly, unless you ran into a 20mm cannon maybe. But for the purpose of responding to problems, road speeds being high is an asset in and of itself, which is entirely separate from tactical speeds. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion raced to Bastogne, arriving before the Germans encircled the town and giving the 101st some serious and needed anti-armour punch. Could an M10 or an M4 unit have made it in time? Maybe. The same can be said for any operation which TDs partook. There is, though, no denying the theory that getting to the fight faster does have a merit of its own, even if it just means that you have more time to select and prepare your battle positions. Tactically, yeah, sure, once the shooting starts, you don't want to be going at high speed too much. You only get one life, and wandering carelessly into the enemy's field of fire isn't good for you. Similarly, you don't want to go so fast that you can't stop before slamming into the ditch, which you couldn't see until you were less than 30 yards away, and so on. Yet it wasn't all bad. There is more to tactical mobility than raw speed. General Ernest was the senior TD commander in Patton's Third Army. He said, quote, "You do not need speed in any tank or tank destroyer, but quick acceleration. In other words, a quick start, stop and turn like a polo pony. The M18 has that." Lieutenant Colonel Peter Kopchak, CO of the 602nd. "We attribute our low loss to the tremendous speed of the M18. On countless occasions, direct fire by 88mm guns failed to get any of the destroyers because our drivers raced the motors to the limit and all the shots hit to the rear of the TDs. The best technique in open warfare, tank destroyers versus tanks, is to take advantage of the superior mobility of the tank destroyer and to make it standard operating procedure to have the TDs change firing position after every 3 or 4 rounds. He also said, quote, "Performance of the M18 tank destroyer was superior in all types of terrain and under all conditions. It is the best cross-country vehicle the Army has." This last was echoed by Lieutenant Colonel McCurry of the 603rd Tank Destroyer Battalion. Quote, "Its speed, endurance, striking power and mobility make it the finest combat vehicle and engine. Combat troops of all arms love the vehicle and have unlimited faith in its ability. It is a wonderful mudder. We have many times pulled tanks, half-tracks, etc. out of bogs. In some cases, we have taken task force objectives with destroyers alone after all other materiel had bogged down." Now, that's probably an argument more for the M24 light tank than for the TD mind, but hey, they had to work with what they had at the time. He continued, "A destroyer crew working as a team is unbeatable. One such spirited M18 crew attacked 10 Panther tanks with only the one M18. They destroyed 2 Panthers at 2,500 yards, and the others fled." Going back to acceleration, Lieutenant Colonel William A. Wood Jr. "Armor and mobility, as yet within present engineering limitations, cannot be made integral. There is still the need of a gun that can go places denied to heavy vehicles. Cross-country mobility showed up. The commanding officer wanted to hang more stuff on the armor, but I recommended he hold off. He is now convinced that mobility is more protection than armor. Don't hang anything on that will slow acceleration. Acceleration is the prime factor. They can't hit you if you aren't there. Only a jackrabbit will last on the field, and this comes closest to it. It would have done your heart good to see 2 M18s wheeled by 2 stuck M4 tanks to flank a towed 88 on a field and knock it out. Those TDs were doing 30 where the M4s had bogged. The 88 never had a chance to lay on them." It's not all unanimous though. A British report from Italy in August of 1944 said, quote, "The American M18 has an unnecessary turn of speed." So was the success of the M18 due to the vehicle or the training? And there is certainly supporting argument for the latter. Lieutenant Colonel McCurry of the 603rd again, quote, "Since initial commitment on 28th of July 1944 in Normandy, this battalion has lost a total of 7 M18 tank destroyers to enemy action against 53 tanks and 15 self-propelled assault guns destroyed. Our extremely low loss to enemy tank fire is attributed to the basic tactics taught at Tank Destroyer Center. The enemy tank can be easily outmaneuvered." Harry Yaidi, in one of his books, I think The Infantry's Armor, makes reference to a tank battalion in Italy which spent 3 days having a nearby tank destroyer unit train them in anti-tank tactics, which were not emphasized in tank school. Their kill ratio against German armor shot up. So what to make of the vehicle's reception? Perhaps Colonel C.R. Landon's commentary is applicable. Quote, "Opinions of the relative value of speed versus armor are the products of battle experience of the armies and are widely divergent. Third Army considers speed desirable. In the First Army, on the contrary, speed in a tank destroyer is considered of slight advantage, and heavy armor, at least frontally, is considered a definite requirement." If you consider the relative natures of the fighting that First Army was dealing with up north versus the Swan across the open fields of central France the Third Army had, you can see why they might have had differing opinions. With respect to the gun, yes, Steve is of course correct that the 76 was inadequate for dealing with heavy German armor from the front. On the other hand, it seemed it didn't really matter. When Tank Destroyer Branch looked into the various reports coming back from the field, it made several conclusions. Yes, an additional ton of armor could be added to the vehicle without particularly affecting the mobility. So a roof kit, for example, was feasible and indeed eventually designed. Adding armor in excess of that required to stop small arms would reduce mobility and, quote, "destroy the special characteristics of this vehicle." And finally, at the time, there was nothing much that the M18 was coming up against which the 76mm couldn't kill, but they felt the 90mm could. Indeed, an argument against the idea of converting M18s to 90mm guns was that the program, quote, would tie up the stock of an admittedly efficient weapon. So if it was by training or vehicle design, the bottom line was irrelevant. The vehicle was knocking out targets. That's your bottom line. So there you go, the M18. Good tank destroyer, it's fit for purpose, absolutely, but not bad in the way it was actually used either. Hope that answers your question. I hope you found it interesting and informative and short. I'll see you on the next one. Take care.